the shattered image. The penthouse was silent, save for the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of blood falling from Salvatore's knuckles. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror, staring at the jagged, silver scar that sliced from his temple down to his jawline, a permanent souvenir from the night his own brother tried to end him. To the world, Salvatore was a beast of the coast, a man whose very face was a warning of the violence he was capable of. But tonight, the beast was tired. Every tailor in the city had been dismissed. Some had trembled so violently they couldn't hold a measuring tape, while others had looked at him with a pity that felt worse than a gunshot. With a roar of frustration, Sal's fist connected with the glass. The mirror spiderwebbed, fracturing his scarred reflection into 1,000 distorted pieces. "I am surrounded by cowards," he spat, his voice a low growl that vibrated in his chest. His right-hand man, Marco, appeared in the doorway, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor. "Sir," Marco whispered, "the gala is in 3 weeks. You need that suit. I've heard of a woman in the garment district. They say she's the best, but there's a catch. She won't flinch at your face. Boss, she can't. She's been blind for 10 years. Sal froze, his bloody hand hovering over the shards. "Bring her," he commanded. "But tell her she lies about her skill. She'll lose more than her sight." The girl in the sun. Illyria's shop smelled of lavender, old silk, and the metallic tang of sewing machines. She sat by the window, the morning sun warming her face, though she hadn't seen its light in a decade. Her fingers moved with supernatural grace, feeling the subtle grain of a piece of midnight blue velvet. She didn't need eyes to know where the fabric was weak or where the dye hadn't taken. For Elena, the world was a symphony of textures and sounds. When the heavy door creaked open, she didn't jump. She heard the weight of the footsteps, expensive Italian leather, heavy treads, the gait of men who carried weapons. "Elena Vance?" Marco's voice was professional, but she could hear the underlying tension. "My employer requires a bespoke suit. Money is no object, but privacy is mandatory." Elena tilted her head, her sightless eyes fixed just past his shoulder. "Your employer sounds like a man with many secrets and very little patience," she replied, her voice like soft linen. Marco stepped closer, dropping a heavy bag of gold coins onto her wooden table. The thud was final. "He is a man who doesn't like to be looked at. You were chosen for your unique perspective." Elena smiled thinly, her fingers tracing the edge of a coin. "I don't look, Mr. Marco. I feel. Tell your master I will come, but he must provide the thread. I suspect his life requires something stronger than silk." Entering the lion's den, the ride to the Salvatore estate was long and suffocating. Elena sat in the back of the armored SUV, her sensitive ears picking up the hum of the engine and the faint click of safety catches being toggled. When the car finally stopped, the air changed. It was colder here, smelling of salt spray from the nearby cliffs and the sharp, clean scent of expensive pine. Marco led her by the elbow, but she pulled away gently. "I can navigate, if you describe the room," she said. Marco sighed. "It's a wide hallway, marble floors, very echoey. The boss is waiting in the library at the end." As she walked, the tap of her white cane echoed like a heartbeat against the cold stone. She felt the shift in atmosphere as she entered the library. The air grew heavy with the smell of aged paper and expensive tobacco. A voice, deep and raspy like gravel grinding against silk, cut through the silence. "Stop right there." Elena halted. She could feel him, a massive, dark presence sitting in the shadows. He was radiating heat and a territorial aggression that would have made any other woman run. "They told me you were blind," the voice said, closer now. She could hear his heavy breathing. "I am," she replied calmly. "And they told me you were a monster. It seems we were both given labels that simplify us far too much." The first touch. A monster? Salvatore laughed, a dark, joyless sound that rippled through the room. He stepped out of the shadows, though he knew it made no difference to her. He stood 6'4", his presence looming over her small frame. He wanted to intimidate her, to see the familiar mask of horror across her face, but she remained as still as a statue. "Most people can't stand to be in the same room as me once they see what's under the light," he growled. Elena reached into her bag and pulled out a soft cloth measuring tape. "Then it's a good thing I brought my own light," she whispered. She stepped forward, breaching his personal space. Sal instinctively flinched, a reaction born of years of being treated like a leper. But she didn't stop. "Arms up, please," she commanded. To his own surprise, the Don of the city obeyed. As she draped the tape over his massive shoulders, her knuckles brushed the skin of his neck. Sal's entire body went rigid. It had been years since someone had touched him without gloves or a weapon. Her hands were warm and surprisingly strong. She moved with clinical precision, her fingers dancing across his chest, measuring the breadth of his torso. Then her hand moved upward. Before he could pull away, her thumb brushed the edge of the scar on his jaw. He grabbed her wrist, his grip like a steel vise. "I told you not to look," he hissed. The geography of survival. Elena didn't flinch at the pain in her wrist. Instead, she leaned in closer, her face inches from his. "I'm not looking, Salvatore. I'm learning," she said softly. Her voice acted like a balm on his frayed nerves. Slowly, his grip loosened, though he didn't let go. "Your skin here," she continued, her fingers returning to the jagged ridge of the scar. "It's thick, tough. It tells me you survived something that was meant to kill you. Why should I be afraid of a miracle?" Sal felt a strange tightness in his throat. A miracle? No one had ever called his deformity a miracle. "It's a mark of failure," Sal countered, his voice losing its edge. "It's a mark of the man who betrayed me." Elena shook her head, her fingers tracing the path of the silver line up to his temple. "No, it's a map. It shows where you were broken and where you grew back stronger. If you want a suit that hides this, you've hired the wrong woman. I sew for the man you are, not the man you pretend to be." She pulled away then, leaving his skin feeling suddenly, agonizingly cold. She began jotting notes in a braille slate, the metallic clicking filling the room. Sal watched her, mesmerized by her lack of judgment. For the first time in a decade, he didn't feel like a beast. He felt seen by the only person who couldn't see him at all, the golden cage. By the third day, the mansion had become a labyrinth of sensory data for Elena. She had learned that the third step on the grand staircase creaked with a high-B note, and that the hallway leading to the kitchen smelled of rosemary and floor wax. Salvatore had given her a room in the east wing, filled with fabrics so expensive they felt like liquid starlight between her fingers. However, the hospitality came with a price. "You don't leave the grounds," Sal had told her, his voice a low rumble. "The city is moving toward a war, and my enemies look for any weakness. To the world, you are now a piece of my property." Elena sat at her sewing machine, the needle humming a steady rhythm. She wasn't used to being property, but she found she didn't mind the silence of this state. It was a man who interrupted that silence who troubled her. Salvatore visited her every evening. He didn't speak much. He would simply sit in the corner chair, watching her work. She could feel his gaze. It was heavy, like a physical weight on her skin. "Why do you stay in the dark?" she asked one night, not looking up from a silk lining. "Because the dark is the only place where I don't have to see the reflection of what I become," he replied. Elena stopped the machine. "Then you're still blind, Salvatore, just in a different way than I am." The uninvited guest. The peace of the sewing room was shattered on the fifth day. Elena heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of multiple boots. Not the measured, respectful pace of Marco, but something aggressive. The door swung open, hitting the wall with a crack. "So, this is the little bird Sal is hiding," a new voice sneered. It was oily and high-pitched, smelling of cheap cologne and expensive gin. This was Lorenzo, Sal's most volatile rival. Elena stood slowly, her hand finding the heavy shears on her table. "The Don is not here," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline spiking in her veins. Lorenzo laughed, and she heard the metallic snick of a lighter. "I didn't come for the beast. I came to see if his taste in women was as ugly as his face." He stepped closer, the heat of his cigarette uncomfortably near her cheek. Elena didn't move. She focused on the sound of his breathing, calculating the distance. Just as Lorenzo reached out to grab her chin, the room's temperature seemed to drop 30 degrees. "Take your hand off her." Salvatore's voice came from the doorway, but it wasn't the voice Elena knew. It was the sound of a predator about to snap a neck. The air in the room became electric with the threat of immediate, catastrophic violence. Elena realizing that the beast wasn't just a nickname, it was a promise, the price of protection. The struggle was brief and brutal. Elena heard the meaty thud of a fist hitting bone, followed by Lorenzo's choked gasp. She stood frozen as furniture was upended, the sounds of a struggle filling the small room. Then, a terrifying silence. "Sal?" she whispered, her hands trembling. She felt him approach. His breathing was ragged, his heart rate so loud she could almost hear it. He smelled of copper and ozone. She reached out, her hand landing on his chest. It was heaving, beneath his shirt. His heart was drumming against his ribs like a trapped animal. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her fingers searching for wounds. He caught her wrists, his hands shaking with suppressed rage. "He touched you," Sal growled, his voice vibrating with a primal possessiveness. "He walked into my house and thought he could touch what is mine." Elena flinched, not at his words, but at the sheer volume of his anger. "I am not a thing to be guarded, Salvatore," she countered, trying to pull away. But he pulled her closer instead, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He was searching for her scent, lavender and silk, to drown out the smell of the blood on his knuckles. For a long minute, the feared Mafia boss clung to the blind seamstress as if she were the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. "In this world," he whispered into her skin, "everything you love is a target. I won't let you be a target." The velvet secret. The next morning, the mansion felt different, tighter, as if the walls themselves were bracing for impact. Salvatore had doubled the guards, and Elena was no longer allowed to walk the halls without Marco. To pass the time, she threw herself into the construction of Sal's suit. It was becoming more than a garment. It was a masterpiece of hidden utility. She sewed reinforced Kevlar panels into the lining of the silk, overlapping them so they wouldn't bulk, and added a secret pocket inside the left lapel, right over the heart. As she worked the final stitches on the vest, she felt a sudden urge to leave a mark, something only he would know. She took a needle and a strand of her own long chestnut hair. With painstaking precision, she embroidered a tiny, invisible knot into the inner lining of the collar. It was an old tailor's superstition, a piece of the maker's soul to protect the wearer. When Sal came to see her that evening, he seemed subdued. He stood still as she fitted the vest over his broad shoulders. As she adjusted the collar, her fingers brushed the scar again. "It's nearly done," she murmured. He looked down at her, his eyes tracing the calm lines of her face. "And what happens when it's finished?" he asked. "Do you go back to your sunlit shop and forget the man in the dark?" Elena didn't answer, but the way her hand lingered on his shoulder told him more than words ever could. Mapping the heart. "Tell me what you see," Elena whispered that night. They were sitting on the balcony, the sound of the ocean crashing against the cliffs below. It was the first time Sal had allowed her outside since the attack. "I see a city that wants to eat me alive," Sal replied, looking out at the glittering lights of the coast. "I see shadows that move even when the wind doesn't blow." Elena reached out, her fingers finding his hand and lacing through his fingers. "No, tell me what you see when you look at me. Don't give me the boss's answer. Give me Salvatore's." Sal turned to her, his breath hitching. He looked at her sightless eyes, which always seemed to be looking at something far more beautiful than the world he inhabited. "I see the only person who hasn't tried to use me or fear me," he said, his voice cracking. "I see a woman who touches a monster and calls a miracle. I see a life I don't deserve." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. The jagged ridge of his scar pressed against her smooth skin. For the first time, he didn't pull away. He let her feel the full extent of his deformity, the physical manifestation of his trauma. "You're not a monster, Sal," she whispered, her breath warm against his lips. "You're just a man who has forgotten how to be loved." He didn't say anything. He simply pulled her into a kiss that tasted of salt, longing, and the terrifying beginning of a war. The fitting of the soul. The tension in the sewing room was thick enough to be cut with Elena's heavy tailor shears. Salvatore stood on a small wooden pedestal, his massive frame draped in the rough basted-together pieces of what would become his armor. Elena moved around him like a moth circling a flame, her hands constantly in motion. To an observer, it was a simple fitting. To Salvatore, it was a slow, exquisite torture. Every time her warm fingertips brushed against the cold, dead nerves as facial scar, a jolt of electricity shot straight to his core. He had spent a decade making people look away. Now, he was being forced to endure someone who saw him more clearly than anyone ever had. "Why do you hold your breath when I touch your jaw?" Elena asked softly, her voice barely a whisper above the snip of her scissors. Salvatore's jaw tightened, the muscle jumping beneath her thumb. "Because I'm waiting for you to flinch," he admitted, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Elena stopped. She stepped onto the pedestal, bringing her face level with his. She reached out with both hands, cupping his scarred cheek with a tenderness that made his eyes sting. "The only reason I would flinch, Salvatore, is if you pulled away." In that moment, the Don of the city's most brutal family realized he was no longer the one in control. The blind girl held his heart in her hands, and she didn't even know it. A gift wrapped in blood. On the 7th day, a package arrived at the gates, addressed specifically to the seamstress. Salvatore's security team intercepted it, but when Sal saw the contents, his blood turned to ice. Inside was a delicate, vintage music box, the exact model Lara had described losing in the accident that had claimed her sight years ago. There was no note, but the message was clear. "We are watching her. We know her past." Salvatore smashed the music box against the wall, the delicate gears scattering across the floor like tiny, golden teeth. He couldn't let her know that his world was already bleeding into hers. He entered her workroom, his face a mask of cold fury. Elena was sitting by the window, her sensitive ears picking up the erratic rhythm of his footsteps. "Something is wrong," she said, her head tilting. "The air smells like smoke and broken metal." Sal stood over her, his shadow engulfing her small frame. He wanted to scream at her to run, to leave this cursed house before his enemies tore her apart to get to him. Instead, he reached out and touched her hair. "I've decided you aren't leaving," he said, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. "The city is too dangerous. You stay here under my shadow." Elena frowned, her hand finding the cold metal of her shears. "Your shadow is a heavy place to live, Salvatore. Is this protection or a prison?" The bullet and the button. The war arrived at midnight. A single high-caliber round shattered the window of the library, narrowly missing Salvatore's head. Within seconds, the estate was a cacophony of sirens, shouting men, and the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of return fire. Salvatore didn't think. He ran straight for the east wing. He burst into Elena's room to find her standing in the center of the floor, remarkably calm despite the chaos. She had her sewing kit clutched to her chest, her sightless eyes wide but unfearing. "The sound of the glass," she said, her voice trembling only slightly. "That wasn't the wind." Sal grabbed her, throwing his heavy, bulletproof coat over her shoulders. "Down on the floor. Now!" He shielded her body with his own, his back to the door, a gold-plated handgun in his grip. As bullets hissed to the hallway outside, Elena reached up, her fingers finding a loose button on his tactical vest. In the middle of a literal death zone, she began to move her needle and thread with impossible steadiness. "What are you doing?" he hissed, stunned. "You're losing a button," she whispered, her fingers flying. A Don cannot face his enemies with loose thread. It shows weakness. Salvatore looked down at her, a strange, hysterical laugh bubbling in his throat. He realized then that while he was a monster made of scars, she was a warrior made of silk, the ghost of the accident. After the attack, the mansion was a fortress of silence. Salvatore sat in the dark, watching Elena sleep. He held a crumpled police report from 10 years ago, the report of the accident that had blinded her. He had spent the night digging into the archives, and what he found made him want to burn the world down. The car that had struck Elena's family hadn't been a drunk driver. It had been a getaway car from a heist ordered by Salvatore's own father. The miracle he saw in her was a tragedy his own bloodline had created. Every time he looked at her beautiful, sightless eyes, he saw his own family sin. When Elena woke, she sensed him in the room immediately. "You're vibrating, Sal, like a wire about to snap." He didn't move. He couldn't bring himself to touch her. "What if the person who took your sight was standing right in front of you?" he asked, his voice hollow. Elena sat up, the silk sheets sliding off her shoulders. She turned toward his voice, her expression unreadable. "I spent years hating a shadow, Salvador. But shadows don't have heartbeats. Shadows don't stay up all night, making sure I'm breathing." She reached out, her hand searching the air until it landed on a scarred cheek. "I don't care who took my eyes. I only care who is helping me see the world again." The ballroom of vipers. The night of the great gala arrived. This was the moment the suit had been built for, a suit that was both a masterpiece of tailoring and a literal suit of armor. Salvatore stood before the mirror, Elena behind him, smoothing the lapels of the midnight black wool. He looked like a king from a dark age, the silver scar on his face standing out in sharp relief against the luxury of the fabric. "Tonight, everyone will be looking at me," Sal said, his jaw tight. "They'll be looking for a reason to strike." Elena stepped around him, her hand sliding down his arm to find his hand. "Then we'll give them something else to look at," she said. She was wearing a dress she had sewn herself, a gown of deep emerald silk that shimmered like a forest in the rain. She looked breathtaking, a vision of pure elegance that contrasted sharply with his rugged, violent energy. Salvatore led her down the grand staircase and into the waiting limousine. As they drove toward the city, he realized this wasn't just about a suit or a gala anymore. He was walking into a room full of vipers with the only thing he truly loved as his date. He squeezed her hand, his thumb tracing her knuckles. "If things go wrong, Marco will take you to the docks. Don't wait for me." Elena squeezed back. "I've spent 10 years in the dark, Sal. I'm not leaving yours." The beast's entrance. The grand doors of Metropolitan Ballroom swung open, and the hum of 1,000 elite conversations died instantly. Salvatore stepped into the light, his presence commanding the room like a physical blow. The midnight black suit Elena had crafted fit him like a second skin, highlighting the lethal power of his frame while lending him an air of terrifying elegance. But it wasn't the suit that held everyone's breath. It was the woman on his arm. Elena walked with her head held high, her emerald gown flowing like a river. She didn't have a cane. She had him. Sal guided her through the crowd of vipers, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of a weapon. He felt the weight of every gaze, the silent judgment of the other families staring at his scarred face and his broken companion. He leaned down, his lips brushing Elena's ear. "They're staring," he whispered, his voice a low growl. "Let them," she replied, her voice calm and steady. "They're staring because they've never seen a lion protect a rose before. They're afraid, Sal, not of your face, but of your heart." Sal tightened his grip on her hand, realized she was right. For the first time, the whispers of the crowd didn't feel like insults. They felt like a surrender. The waltz of shadows. The orchestra began a slow, haunting waltz. Salvatore, a man who usually stood in the corners of rooms with his hand on his holster, led Elena to the center of the dance floor. He placed his hand on the small of her back, and she rested her hand on his broad shoulder, her fingers finding the exact spot where she had sewn her hair into his lapel. As they began to move, the rest of the world blurred into a haze of perfume and candlelight. Sal moved with a grace he didn't know he possessed, his body instinctively protecting hers from the other dancers. "You're dancing perfectly," Elena whispered, her face tilted toward the warmth of his chest. "I'm just following the sound of your breathing," Sal admitted. It was the truth. Her steady, rhythmic breath was the only thing keeping him grounded in a room full of people who wanted him dead. Suddenly, the music shifted, and Sal felt a presence approaching. He didn't need eyes to know it was Lorenzo. The rival boss stepped into their path, a predatory smile on his face. "Lovely party, Salvatore. But be careful," Lorenzo sneered, his eyes flicking to Elena. "In this room, the prettiest things are usually the first to be broken." Sal stopped dancing, his body turning into a pillar of ice. The war had just become personal. The Viper strike. Lorenzo's comment was a spark in a powder keg. Salvatore's hand moved toward his jacket. where the hidden holster Elena had sewn was waiting. But Elena's hand reached out first. She didn't reach for a weapon. She reached for Lorenzo's voice. "Mr. Lorenzo," she said, her sightless eyes fixed exactly where his throat was. "You smell of expensive gin and cheap desperation. A man who barks so loudly usually doesn't have the teeth to bite." The room went silent. No one spoke to a mafia head that way, let alone a fragile girl. Lorenzo's face turned a deep, humiliated red. He stepped forward, raising a hand as if to strike her, but he never got the chance. In a blur of motion, Sal had Lorenzo's wrist in a crushing grip. The sound of bone beginning to creak echoed in the quiet ballroom. "Touch her," Sal hissed, his voice so low it was barely human, "and I will not just kill you. I will erase every person who carries your name from the face of this earth." He shoved Lorenzo back with such force the man stumbled into a table of crystal. Sal didn't wait for a response. He swept Elena up and walked out. The suit she made him glinting like armor under the chandeliers. They weren't just leaving a party. They were declaring war. The secret in the lining. Back at the mansion, the adrenaline of the night began to fade, replaced by a heavy, suffocating tension. Salvatore paced the library, his jacket discarded on the sofa. He felt exposed, not because of the scar, but because Lorenzo had seen his weakness. He looked at Elena, who was sitting quietly, her fingers tracing the edge of the suit jacket he had thrown down. "You shouldn't have spoken to him like that," Sal said, his voice thick with worry. "He's a dog with no honor. He'll come for you." Elena's fingers stopped moving. She had found a hidden pocket she had sewn over his heart. "He already came for me once, Sal. 10 years ago." Sal froze. "What are you talking about?" Elena pulled a small, crumpled piece of paper from the pocket. A note she had found hidden in materials Marco had brought her. It was a fragment of a ledger from Sal's father's era. "The car that hit my family, it wasn't an accident. It was a hit meant for a rival, ordered by the Salvatore name. I've known for 3 days." Sal felt the world tilt. He looked at her, waiting for the hatred, waiting for her to tell him to stay away. Instead, she held the jacket out to him. "I didn't finish this suit to hide you, Sal. I finished it to protect the only man who ever looked at my darkness and didn't turn away. The blood pact, the revelation of the past didn't break them. It forged them into something new." Salvatore knelt at Elena's feet, his head resting in her lap. The great, scarred beast of the underworld was finally brought to his knees, not by a bullet, but by a grace he couldn't comprehend. "I will spend every second of my life making up for what my name took from you," he swore, his voice cracking. Elena ran her hands through his hair, her touch a benediction. "Then start by surviving the night," she whispered. "Lorenzo won't wait for morning." As if on cue, the distant sound of an explosion rocked the estate. The power cut out, plunging the mansion into the total darkness that Elena lived in every day. But for the first time, Salvatore wasn't afraid of the dark. He stood up, reaching for the suit jacket. As he slipped it on, he felt the weight of the Kevlar and the warmth of the hair she had sewn into the collar. He pulled his weapon, the moonlight catching the silver of his scar. "Marco, get the cars," he bellowed. He turned to Elena, kissing her fiercely. "Stay in the panic room. I'm going to end this." Elena gripped his lapels. "Remember, Sal," she said as the sounds of gunfire began to erupt outside. "You're wearing my soul. Don't let them scratch it." The symphony of the dark. The mansion was no longer a home. It was a tomb of shadows. With the power cut, the guards scrambled, blinded by the sudden transition from light to pitch black. But for Elena, nothing had changed. The darkness was her domain. As the first window shattered in the west wing, she didn't scream. She listened. She heard the heavy metallic click of tactical boots, too many for it to be Sal's men. She heard the rustle of nylon windbreakers and the sharp, rhythmic breathing of men pumped full of adrenaline. "They're in the foyer," she whispered to herself, her heart hammering against her ribs like a bird in a cage. She didn't reach for a cane. Instead, she reached for the walls she had spent weeks mapping by touch. She moved with a ghost-like fluidity that no sighted person could mimic in the dark. Every creak of the floorboards told her exactly where the invaders were. She slipped into the service hallway. the narrow passage smelling of dust and old wood. Behind her, a voice hissed, "Find the girl. Lorenzo want her alive," but he didn't say anything about keeping her pretty. Elena pressed her back against the cold stone, her fingers finding a heavy iron candlestick. She wasn't just a seamstress anymore. She was a shadow waiting to strike back at the world that thought she was helpless. The beast unleashed. Outside, on the rain-slicked driveway, Salvatore was a whirlwind of calculated violence. The midnight black suit Elena had made him was splattered with mud and blood, but the Kevlar panels she had hidden in the silk caught 2 rounds that would have otherwise pierced his heart. He moved with a terrifying speed, his handgun spitting fire into the darkness. Every time a muzzle flash illuminated the yard, his scarred face looked like a demon's mask, frozen in a snarl of protective rage. "Where is she?" he roared, grabbing a wounded mercenary by the throat. The man sputtered, blood leaking from his lips. Inside, Lorenzo's elite team, they're already in her room. Sal didn't wait for the man to finish. He snapped his neck with a sickening crack and sprinted toward the house. His mind was a chaotic loop of her face, her touch, and the way she had called his scar a miracle. If he lost her, there would be nothing left of Salvatore but the beast. He burst through the kitchen doors, sliding across the marble. The house was silent, too silent. "Elena!" he screamed, his voice echoing through the hollow halls. The only answer was a distant, chilling sound of a music box starting to play a haunting, familiar melody from the upper floors. The hunter and the prey. Elena heard Sal's voice, but she couldn't answer. A rough hand was clamped over her mouth, and the cold steel of a knife was pressed against her throat. "One sound, and I'll give you a scar to match your boyfriend's." A voice rasped in her ear. It was Lorenzo's right-hand man, a sadist who enjoyed the hunt. He had tracked her to the service stairs, thinking his night vision goggles gave him the advantage. What he didn't realize was that in the absolute darkness of the inner walls, the goggles were glitching against the lack of ambient light. Elena didn't struggle. She went limp, making him believe she was fainting from terror. As his grip loosened slightly, she used her heightened sense of smell to locate his face. He smelled the tobacco and stale sweat. With sudden, violent bursts of strength, she slammed her head back into his nose. She heard the satisfying crunch of cartilage. As he howled and clutched his face, she dropped to the floor, crawling beneath the narrow gap of a heavy oak table. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, razor-sharp embroidery scissors she always carried. "I may not see you," she whispered into the dark, her voice cold as ice, "but I can hear exactly where your heart is beating." A stitch in time. Salvatore reached the top of the stairs just as a gunshot rang out from the service wing. His heart stopped. He threw himself through the door, his weapon raised, only to find a scene he never expected. Lorenzo's assassin was on the floor, clutching a deep puncture wound in his thigh, howling in agony. Elena was standing over him, her emerald dress torn at the shoulder, her hand steady as she held the blood-stained scissors. She looked like a vengeful goddess emerging from the gloom. "Sal?" she asked, her voice trembling now that the immediate danger had passed. Sal didn't look at the assassin. He dropped his gun and gathered her into his arms, crushing her against his chest. He felt the dampness of her tears against his neck. "I've got you," he breathed, his voice breaking. "I've got you." He looked down at the suit jacket she had made him. There was a jagged tear in the shoulder where a bullet had grazed him, but the silk had held. She had saved his life twice over, once with the armor, and once by giving him something worth living for. He looked at the wounded man on the floor and felt a cold, dark resolve. This wasn't just a turf war anymore. Lorenzo had tried to stain the only pure thing in Sal's life, the king's ultimatum. The sun began to rise over the smoking ruins of the estate's gatehouse. Salvatore stood on the lawn, his men surrounding him, their heads bowed in respect. He was still wearing the suit, though it was now a testament to the night's brutality. He held Elena's hand firmly in his, refusing to let go even for a second. Marco approached, his face grim. "Lorenzo has retreated to his penthouse in the city, boss. He's calling for a sit-down. He wants to negotiate." Sal looked at Elena, then back at the city skyline. "Negotiate?" Sal laughed, a sound that chilled the bones of everyone present. He reached up and touched the scar on his face, then ran his fingers over the hair Elena had sewn into his collar. "Tell Lorenzo there will be no sit-down. Tell him I am coming for everything he owns. I am going to burn his empire until there is nothing left but ash, and then I am going to make him watch as I build a world where she never has to hide again." He turned to Elena, his voice softening. "Stay with Marco. I have to finish this." Elena shook her head, her grip on his hand tightening. "No, Sal. You're wearing my work. Where the suit goes, I go. Let the city see the beast and the seamstress together. The fortress in the sky." Salvatore's temporary headquarters was a glass-walled penthouse overlooking the city. It was the opposite of the estate, sharp, modern, and clinical. Elena sat on a leather sofa, her fingers tracing the unfamiliar textures. The air here didn't smell like lavender. It smelled of ozone and high-end electronics. Sal was in the next room, his voice a low, rhythmic bark as he coordinated the systematic dismantling of Lorenzo's assets. He had become a ghost of himself, a man of pure shadow and steel. Yet every 20 minutes, he would walk into a room just to touch Elena's shoulder, confirming she was still there. "You're working too hard, Sal," she said, sensing before he even crossed the threshold. Sal sat beside her, the weight of his body sinking the cushions. He took her hand, his thumb tracing the calluses on her fingertips. "I'm making sure that when we walk out of this, there's no one left to look for us," he replied. He looked at her tattered emerald dress and felt a pang of guilt. He had dragged a creature of light into his cavern of blood. "Marco is bringing you new clothes," he whispered. Elena shook her head. "I don't want new clothes, Sal. I want my needle. If we're going to war, I need to finish what I started. Your suit still has a tear in the shoulder. The tailor of retribution." The penthouse was transformed into a makeshift workshop. Between the maps of the city and the monitors showing the stock market crashes of Lorenzo's front companies, Elena sat with a single lamp, repairing the damage to Salvatore's suit. She worked with a feverish intensity. She wasn't just mending fabric. She was weaving a prayer for his survival. She could hear the city below, the sirens, the distant echoes of the chaos Sal was unleashing. Every time a news report mentioned a warehouse fire or a dockside accident, she knew it was him. As she sewed, she realized she was no longer just a seamstress. She was the architect of his confidence. When she finally finished the repair, she didn't stop. She took a small, silver thread she had found in his mother's old jewelry box and embroidered a tiny, intricate rose inside the cuff of his sleeve. It was a secret mark, a reminder of the garden where they had first shared a moment of peace. When she presented the jacket to him that evening, Sal looked at the repair. It was invisible to the eye, but to his touch, it felt like a scar that had finally healed. "It's perfect," he whispered. Elena stood tall. "Then go. End this so we can go home." The Judas kiss. The betrayal came from within. Marco, the man who had found Elena, the man Sal trusted most, stood in the doorway with a heavy heart and a heavier gun. "I'm sorry, boss," Marco whispered, his voice cracking. "Lorenzo has my family. He said if I didn't bring him the girl, he'd send them to me in pieces." Sal didn't reach for his weapon. He looked at his oldest friend with a cold, tragic clarity. The suit Elena had made him felt heavy like a shroud. "You should have told me, Marco," Sal said softly. "I would have saved them for you." Marco's hand shook. Elena stood up, her hand finding the back of the sofa for balance. She didn't sound afraid. She sounded disappointed. "You're making a mistake, Marco. Lorenzo won't give them back. He doesn't know how to keep a promise." Before Marco could pull the trigger, the penthouse elevators hissed open. A team of Sal's elite loyalists, tipped off by a silent alarm Sal had installed the moment they arrived, swarmed the room. In the chaos, Marco was disarmed and pinned. Sal stood over him, the silver scar on his face gleaming in the moonlight. "Take him to the basement," Sal commanded, "and find his family. I'll deal with him when the sun comes up." The beast's solitude. With Marco gone, Salvatore felt the full weight of his isolation. He sat in his office, the lights of the city reflected in the glass like cold, distant diamonds. He realized that in his world, love wasn't a luxury. It was a death sentence. He looked at the suit jacket hanging on the chair, the suit Elena had bled for prayed over and perfected. He thought about sending her away, truly, away, to a place where the name Salvatore was never whispered. But he knew she wouldn't go. She had tied her soul to his with 1,000 silk threads. Elena entered the room, her footsteps silent on the plush carpet. She didn't say a word. She simply walked behind him and began to massage the tension in his shoulders. "You're thinking of leaving me behind again," she said. Sal leaned his head back against her. "It's the only way you stay safe, Elena." She leaned down, her lips brushing his ear. Safe is just another word for alone. "Sal, I was safe in my shop, and I was dying of boredom. I'd rather be in the middle of your storm than in the middle of someone else's sunshine." Sal turned around, pulling her into his lap. He realized then that he couldn't protect her by hiding her. He could only protect her by standing beside her. The invitation to the end. A courier arrived at dawn. No bombs, no bullets, just a simple, cream-colored envelope. Inside was an invitation to the old cathedral at the center of the city. One final meeting. No guards. Just the two of us to settle the blood debt. It was signed by Lorenzo. It was an obvious trap, a desperate move by a man who had lost everything else. Salvatore looked at the letter, then at Elena. He knew that if he went alone, he would never come back. If he didn't go, the war would drag on until everyone he cared about was dead. "I'm going with you," Elena said, her voice like iron. Sal started to protest, but she held up a hand. "I'm the reason he's doing this. He thinks I'm your weakness. We need to show him that I'm your strength." Sal looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the fire beneath the grace. He reached for the suit, sliding it on. He felt the silver rose in the cuff, the hair in the collar, and the Kevlar over his heart. He wasn't just a mafia boss anymore. He was a man loved by a woman who saw through the scars. "Fine," he said, checking his clip, "but you were the emerald dress." I want him to see exactly what he's losing to. The shadow of the cathedral. The old cathedral stood like a jagged stone tooth against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. It was a place of silence and incense, now repurposed for a meeting of monsters. Salvatore stepped out of the black sedan, his hand immediately reaching back to help Elena. The air was cold, carrying the scent of damp earth and coming rain. Sal adjusted his jacket, feeling the familiar weight of the suit. It was more than fabric now. It was a physical manifestation of Elena's belief in him. He looked at the massive oak doors and felt a premonition of his own end. "The bells," Elena whispered, her head tilted. "They're out of tune." Sal listened. She was right. The distant tolling sounded flat, metallic. "It's an omen," Sal muttered. He checked the hidden holster at the small of his back. Then the backup blade Elena had suggested he tuck into his boot. He felt a strange sense of calm. For years he had lived for the kill, but tonight he was living for the woman standing beside him. "If I tell you to run," he said, turning her to face him, "you don't look back. You find the light and you stay in it." Elena reached up, her fingers finding the silver rose she had embroidered on his cuff. "I told you before, Sal, my light is wherever you are." The walk of the damned. They walked down the long, echoing nave of the cathedral. The only light came from hundreds of flickering votive candles, casting dancing shadows against the high, arched ceilings. Salvatore's boots clicked rhythmically against the stone, a stark contrast to the soft rustle of Elena's emerald silk. He could feel eyes on them from the darkness of the confessionals and the choir loft. Lorenzo's men were everywhere, hidden like rats in the walls. Sal kept his arm locked with Elena's, his body positioned to take any sudden fire. "He's at the altar," Elena murmured, her ears, sharpened by a decade of darkness, picked up the scratched chair in the shallow, nervous breathing of a man who knew he was cornered. Lorenzo was sitting in the front pew, looking small beneath the massive, agonized figure of the crucified Christ. He didn't look like a mob boss anymore. He looked like a ghost. As they approached, Lorenzo stood, his eyes immediately darting to Sal's scarred face. "You actually brought her," Lorenzo sneered, though his voice lacked its usual bite. "You brought a blind girl to a slaughterhouse. You really have lost your mind, Salvatore." The devil's logic. "I didn't bring a victim, Lorenzo. I brought the only person who knows what you really are, Salvatore replied, his voice echoing through the vast space. He stopped 10 feet from his rival, his hand resting on the hilt of his hidden weapon. The tension was a living thing, vibrating between the three of them. Lorenzo laughed, a dry, rattling sound. He pulled a heavy folder from a pew and tossed it onto the stone floor. Does she know, Sal? Does she know that while you were protecting her this week, you were also buying up the very company that manufactured the faulty brakes on her father's car? Elera's grip on Sal's arm tightened. Sal felt a surge of cold fury. It was a classic Lorenzo move, mixing a half-truth with a poison lie. I bought that company to destroy it, Sal hissed, to make sure no one else suffered because of my father's greed. Lorenzo stepped closer, his face twisted in a mask of spite. Or did you buy it to bury the evidence? You're wearing a suit made by a girl you blinded. That's not love, Salvatore. That's a trophy. Elena stepped forward, releasing Sal's arm. She looked toward Lorenzo, her face serene. A trophy is something you keep in a case, Mr. Lorenzo. A partner is someone you sow your soul into. You wouldn't know the difference. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Lorenzo's face went from pale to a deep, bruised purple. Enough, he screamed. I didn't come here for a sermon from a charity case. He raised his hand, and suddenly, the cathedral was filled with the tiny, dancing crimson lights of laser sights. One appeared on Sal's chest, another on his forehead, but the third, the one that made Sal's heart stop, rested directly over Elera's heart, vivid against the emerald green of her dress. Salvatore didn't think. He didn't wait for a signal. He moved with the predatory instinct that had kept him alive in the gutters of the city. He spun Elena behind a massive marble pillar, just as the first shot rang out, the bullet chipping the stone inches from his head. "Get down!" he roared, pulling his gold-plated handgun. The cathedral exploded into chaos. The sacred silence was shattered by the roar of automatic weapons. Sal leaned out from the pillar, his eyes cold and focused. He wasn't just fighting for territory anymore. He was fighting for the only light he had ever known. He felt a sting in his shoulder as a bullet grazed the silk, but the Kevlar Elena had sewn inside held firm. She was protecting him even now. The seamstress's courage. Elena crouched in the darkness behind the pillar, the air around her filled with the smell of gunpowder and ancient dust. She could hear everything. The location of the snipers in the loft, the heavy thud of Lorenzo's boots as he tried to flee toward the vestry, and the frantic, heavy breathing of Salvatore as he traded fire. Most people would have been paralyzed, but Elena's mind was a map of sound. She realized that one of the snipers was reloading, the metallic clack-clack of the magazine coming from the balcony directly above Sal. "Sal, 12 o'clock high. 3 seconds," she screamed at the top of her lungs. Salvatore didn't question her. He rolled from his cover, aiming upward and firing 3 shots in rapid succession. A body tumbled over the railing of the choir loft, crashing onto the pews below. Sal looked back at her, his eyes wide with shock and adrenaline. She had just saved his life. But the victory was short-lived. A heavy hand grabbed Elena's hair from behind the pillar. Lorenzo had circled around. "If you want her back," Lorenzo yelled, holding a snub-nosed revolver to Elena's temple, "you'll drop the gun and walk into the light, beast." The beast choice, the silence that followed Lorenzo's threat, was more deafening than the gunfire. Salvatore stood in the center of the aisle, the flickering candlelight catching the silver of his scar and the cold steel of his weapon. His heart was a hammer against his ribs, but his hands were steady. He looked at Elena, her head tilted back by the force of Lorenzo's grip, the emerald silk of her dress stained with the dust of the cathedral. "Drop it, Sal, or I'll see if her blood is as green as that dress." Lorenzo screamed, his voice cracking with the desperation of a dying animal. Salvatore didn't hesitate. He slowly opened his hand, letting his gold-plated handgun clatter onto the stone floor. "Let her go, Lorenzo. You have me. You've always wanted the beast on his knees. Well, look at me." Sal lowered himself slowly, his knees hitting the cold marble. He was the most powerful man in the city, but in this moment, he was nothing more than a man terrified for the woman he loved. Elena's sightless eyes were wide, fixed on the sound of Sal's voice. "Don't do it, Sal," she whispered. "He won't let us leave either way." Lorenzo pressed the barrel harder against her temple. "Shut up. You're just the bait. He's the one I'm going to skin." The blind spot. Lorenzo was so focused on Salvatore's surrender that he forgot the one thing he had always mocked, Elera's blindness. To him, she was a helpless object. To Elera, the world was a map of vibration and sound. She felt the slight tremble in Lorenzo's hand, heard the frantic, uneven rhythm of his heart, and smelled the metallic scent of the gun's oil. Most importantly, she felt the way he shifted his weight to his left leg to keep his balance while holding her. She wasn't just a seamstress. She was a woman who lived by the precision of a needle. "You're shaking, Mr. Lorenzo," Elera said, her voice eerily calm. A man who shakes shouldn't hold a weapon. Before he could respond, Elera reached into the hidden fold of her emerald gown. She didn't pull a gun. She pulled the heavy, professional-grade tailor shears she had kept concealed. With a movement so fast it was a blur, she drove the pointed end of the shears into Lorenzo's foot, pinning it to the wooden floorboards. Lorenzo let out a guttural scream of agony, his grip on her hair loosening for a split second. It was the only opening Salvatore needed, the mercy of the scarred. Salvatore moved like a shadow unleashed. He didn't reach for his gun. He reached for Lorenzo. He tackled the rival boss away from Elera, the two men crashing into the altar rail. Sal's hands, the hands of a butcher, found Lorenzo's throat. The rage of a decade, the betrayal by his brother, the death of his parents, the blinding of Elera, all of it flowed into his grip. Lorenzo's face turned a deep, sickly purple as he clawed at Sal's wrists. Sal looked down at the man who had tried to destroy the only beautiful thing in his life. His scarred face twisted into a mask of pure vengeance. "Sal, stop." Elera's voice rang through the cathedral, sharp as a bell. Salvatore froze, his fingers inches away from crushing Lorenzo's windpipe. He looked back at her. She was standing by the pillar, her hand over her heart, her face pale. "If you kill him like this, you become exactly what he said you were," she said softly. "Don't let him take your soul. 2. You're wearing my work, Salvatore. Don't stain it with his cowardice." Sal looked back at Lorenzo, who was gasping for air, a pathetic heap of a man. Slowly, Sal released his grip. He stood up, smoothing the lapels of his suit. "He's not worth the thread," Sal whispered. The final stitch. The police sirens began to wail in the distance, a blue and red pulse against the stained glass. Salvatore's men flooded the cathedral, securing the perimeter and dragging a whimpering Lorenzo away. Sal walked over to Elera, his breathing finally slowing. He took her hands in his, checking for any new wounds. "It's over," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The war, the debt, it's all over." He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. He felt the silver rose he had embroidered on his cuff press against her cheek. "Not quite," Elera whispered, pulling back slightly. She reached up and touched the jagged scar on his face. For the first time, she didn't just trace it, she kissed it. "I can feel the tension leaving you, Salvatore. The map is changing." Sal looked at her, his heart full for the first time in his life. He realized that the suit she had made him wasn't just armor against bullets. It was armor against himself. He picked her up in his arms, the emerald silk and the midnight wool blending together as he carried her toward the exit. "Let's go home. Elera, I have 1,000 lilies to plant in that garden." The grand cliffhanger. They reached the steps of the cathedral, the rain finally beginning to fall in a soft, cleansing mist. The black sedan was waiting, its engine humming. Salvatore opened the door for Elera, but as she went to step inside, she suddenly stopped, her head tilted, her brow furrowing. "Sal, why did the rain stop hitting your side of the car?" Salvatore frowned, looking up at the sky. The rain hadn't stopped. Then he followed her gaze, or where her gaze would have been. Across the street, in the shadow of a darkened clock tower, a single high-powered red laser appeared. It didn't dance. It didn't shake. It rested perfectly on the center of Elera's forehead. Sal's blood turned to liquid nitrogen. He realized then that Lorenzo was never the real threat. Lorenzo was just a distraction. From the shadows of the tower, a figure stepped into the light. A man with the exact same silver scar as Salvatore. His brother. "The suit looks good on you, brother." A voice echoed from a loudspeaker. "But it's a shame about the girl. I always did hate a witness." A single shot echoed through the night. Screen cuts to black.